Cowboy Caleb Thornton was fixing his fence when he heard the horses. But among the 200 Apache warriors that appeared on the hill, he spotted someone looking at him with familiar eyes. That day, Caleb would learn how a single decision he made 15 years ago had turned into a massive conspiracy. Because that little Apache boy had now become a chief, and the secret he brought with him was big enough to change Caleb's entire life. There were forged debt papers, corrupt judges, and enemies ready to threaten his life. But Caleb hadn't yet learned the most shocking truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas Valley as Caleb Thornton worked on repairing the split-rail fence that marked the northern boundary of his ranch. At 47, his hands still moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades building something from nothing. The Thornton Ranch wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was honest work on honest land, paid for with sweat and sacrifice rather than schemes and shortcuts. He was adjusting a loose post when he heard them, the unmistakable sound of many horses moving in coordinated formation. Not the casual clip-clop of neighbors visiting or the hurried gallop of a messenger, but something else entirely. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Caleb straightened slowly, his weathered hand instinctively moving to shade his eyes against the morning glare. What he saw on the ridgeline above his property defied every expectation, every assumption he had about how this ordinary Saturday would unfold. Apache warriors, more than he had ever seen in one place, arranged in perfect military formation across the hilltop. Their horses stood motionless as statues, their riders painted for war, weapons clearly visible even at this distance. The sight sent ice water through Caleb's veins, because everyone in the territory knew the Apache had been gone for over a decade. Relocated, the government said. Pacified, removed to reservations hundreds of miles away where they couldn't threaten white settlements. Yet here they were, impossible as morning snow in July. But before we continue with this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button, because what happens next will absolutely shock you. Caleb's rifle leaned against the fence post just 3 feet away, loaded and ready as it always was, when he worked alone on the far reaches of his property. His hand moved toward it automatically, muscle memory from years of frontier living taking over. But something made him pause, something that cut through his fear and confusion, like a knife through cloth. At the front of the formation, clearly the leader of this impossible war party, sat a young man whose presence commanded attention even from a distance. He was painted for battle like the others, traditional Apache war paint covering half his face in bold stripes of red and black. But it was his eyes that stopped Caleb cold. Even across the considerable distance, those eyes seemed to be staring directly at him with an intensity that was both familiar and impossible. The war party remained perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. In Caleb's experience, Apache war parties were instruments of swift, decisive violence. They struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. They didn't arrange themselves in neat formations and wait around for conversations. Yet here they sat, 200 armed warriors, as motionless as a painting, all attention focused on their young leader as he continued to study Caleb with those haunting, familiar eyes. Then the impossible became the unprecedented. The young chief raised his hand, and every warrior behind him responded as one, lowering their weapons in a gesture that could only be interpreted as peaceful intent. But that wasn't the strangest part, not even close. The young man dismounted with fluid grace and began walking down the hillside toward Caleb's fence. Alone, unarmed, his hands visible and empty in what was unmistakably a gesture of peace. With each step, more details became clear. He was young, perhaps mid-20s, but he carried himself with the authority of someone much older. His clothing was a fascinating blend of traditional Apache dress and more modern frontier wear. buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, alongside leather boots that had clearly seen many miles of hard travel. As he drew closer, something in Caleb's chest began to tighten with recognition. There was something about the way this young man moved, about the set of his shoulders, about those eyes that seemed to reach across years and miles to touch memories Caleb had carefully buried. The warrior stopped just outside the fence line, close enough now that Caleb could see every detail of his face. The war paint couldn't hide the scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a thin white line that spoke of an old injury, long healed but never forgotten. And suddenly, impossibly, Caleb knew exactly where he had seen that scar before. "Caleb," the young man said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. It wasn't a greeting or a question. It was recognition, spoken like a name that had been carried in someone's heart for a very long time. And in that single word, 15 years collapsed into nothing. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as memories flooded back with vivid clarity. A winter night 15 years ago. A small Apache boy, barely 12 years old, found bleeding and near death by the creek that ran behind his property. Injuries that should have killed him. A head wound that had left that distinctive scar. Broken ribs. Infection that had nearly claimed his life during long nights of fever and delirium. The boy's name had been Ian, and Caleb had spent 2 weeks nursing him back to health in secret, knowing that harboring an Apache, even a dying child, could mean death for both of them if discovered. "Ian," Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. The young man's painted face split into a slight smile. "You remember? Good. I wasn't entirely certain you would. But how? The soldiers said your people were all relocated to reservations in Oklahoma territory. Everyone said the Apache were gone from these lands for good." A bitter laugh escaped Ian's lips. "The soldiers said many things, Caleb. Most of them were lies designed to make white settlers feel safer about stealing our ancestral lands." He gestured toward the mounted warriors behind him. "These men represent 7 different tribes. Apache, yes, but also Comanche, Cheyenne, and others. We are not refugees from Oklahoma reservations. We are something new, something the government never planned for." Caleb's eyes swept over the war party again, this time noticing details that had escaped him in his initial shock. The warriors weren't uniformly Apache. Different tribal markings, different weapons, different styles of dress and decoration. This wasn't a traditional war party at all. It was some kind of confederation, multiple tribes unified under the leadership of the boy he had once saved. "What kind of something new?" Caleb asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. "A confederation built around a simple principle," Ian replied, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to command. "Justice, real justice. Not the kind dispensed by corrupt courts and bought officials." He reached into a leather satchel at his side and withdrew something that made Caleb's blood turn to ice water. It was an official-looking document, heavy paper with multiple wax seals along the bottom. Even from a distance, Caleb could make out the ornate letterhead. "Whitman Trading Company, Legal Division." 3 days ago," Ian said, holding up the document, "Elias Whitman filed a legal claim against your ranch. He alleges that you owe him $800 in unpaid debts, money supposedly borrowed 2 years ago for cattle feed and winter supplies." Caleb's jaw tightened with righteous anger. "That's an outright lie. I've never borrowed so much as a penny from Whitman or anyone else. I pay cash for everything. Always have. Always will." "I know," Ian said with calm certainty, "because I've spent the last 2 years conducting a thorough investigation into Elias Whitman's business practices. This fraudulent claim against your ranch is the 17th such case I've documented. The previous 16 families weren't as fortunate as you're about to be." Caleb felt the world shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. This wasn't a social visit or a nostalgic reunion between a man and the boy he'd once saved. This was something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. "What happened to those other 16 families?" he asked, though the hollow feeling in his stomach suggested he already knew. Ian's expression hardened, and for a moment Caleb glimpsed the steel beneath the diplomatic exterior. "They lost everything. Their land, their homes, their livestock, their futures. Whitman has assembled a very convincing network, a skilled lawyer who specializes in property seizures, a judge who asks no inconvenient questions, and local officials who find it profitable to look the other way." He paused, letting the full weight of that revelation sink in. "But Elias Whitman made one critical miscalculation when he chose to target your ranch." "What miscalculation?" "He chose to steal from the one man who saved my life," Ian said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And that is a debt I can never allow to go unpaid." The magnitude of what Ian was telling him began to penetrate Caleb's shock. He had known Elias Whitman was ruthless. Everyone in the territory knew that much. But this level of systematic, organized theft was beyond anything he had imagined. It spoke to corruption that reached deep into the very institutions meant to protect honest people. "How do you know all this?" Caleb asked, studying the young chief's face with new eyes. The scared, broken boy he had nursed back to health was gone completely, replaced by someone who radiated quiet authority and dangerous intelligence. "Because after you saved my life, I didn't simply disappear into the wilderness to live as a traditional Apache," Ian replied. "I recognized that our world was changing, that survival would require more than traditional skills. So I learned to navigate both worlds, mine and yours." He gestured toward his warriors, and Caleb noticed for the first time that many of them carried modern rifles alongside traditional weapons, wore combinations of tribal dress and frontier clothing that suggested deep familiarity with white culture. "These men follow me not because of bloodline or ancient tradition alone. They follow me because I've given them something more valuable than anything Whitman could offer: purpose backed by knowledge and the skills to achieve real justice." Ian's expression grew serious, almost professorial. "I didn't vanish 15 years ago, Caleb. I traveled east, first to mission schools, then to real institutions of learning in St. Louis, Chicago, even briefly to universities back east. I studied law, business, military strategy. I learned how men like Whitman operate, how they manipulate legal systems and corrupt officials to steal what doesn't belong to them." Caleb stared at him in amazement. The transformation was almost impossible to believe. The Apache boy he remembered had barely spoken English, had been unable to read or write in any language. Now he stood here discussing legal strategy with the confidence of a trained attorney. "So, what exactly are you proposing?" Caleb asked. "Tomorrow morning," Ian said with precision that suggested careful planning, "Whitman plans to arrive here with Sheriff Morrison and a court order to seize your property. They expect to find you alone, defenseless, with no way to prove that the debt papers are forgeries." Caleb's stomach dropped as he realized the tactical brilliance of the timing. Tomorrow was Saturday. Banks closed, government offices empty, no way to quickly gather witnesses or documentation. It was perfectly calculated to prevent any effective response. "But you're not going to be alone," Ian continued, "because I have something Elias Whitman doesn't know exists." He whistled sharply, a sound that carried clearly across the valley. One of his warriors immediately spurred his horse down the hillside, approaching at a controlled gallop. The man dismounted smoothly and presented Ian with an elaborately decorated leather satchel. From the satchel, Ian withdrew what appeared to be a substantial folder of documents. Even from where he stood, Caleb could see that the folder was thick, organized with colored tabs, and clearly the result of extensive preparation. Depositions from all 16 families Whitman has defrauded, Ian explained, holding up sections of the documentation. Copies of the original loan agreements, the legitimate ones, before they were altered. Bank records that clearly show the forgeries. Financial documents proving Whitman's payments to corrupt officials. And most importantly, sworn testimony from a clerk in Whitman's own office who grew tired of being complicit in his crimes. Caleb stared at the documents in amazement. The scope of evidence was staggering. This could destroy him completely. It could do more than destroy him, Ian said, his voice taking on a cold edge that reminded Caleb this man commanded 200 armed warriors. But first, we need to let him make his move. We need to allow him to reveal himself completely, to commit his crimes in front of witnesses before we spring the trap. And if something goes wrong, Caleb asked, if the sheriff sides with him despite all this evidence, if the corruption goes deeper than we think. Ian glanced back at his mounted warriors, and Caleb caught something cold and final in his expression, something that spoke of plans within plans, of contingencies that didn't depend on courts or laws. Then we move to a different kind of justice, he said quietly. The kind that doesn't require corrupt judges or bought officials. The kind that our peoples understood long before your courts existed. The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun barrel. Caleb realized that this young man, this leader of a multi-tribal confederation, hadn't come merely to help him fight a legal battle. He had come prepared for war if legal means proved insufficient. There's something else you need to know, Ian said, his voice dropping to a more personal register. Whitman didn't choose your ranch randomly. He knows about that night 15 years ago. He knows you helped me, and he's been planning this revenge ever since. Caleb felt ice forming in his veins. How could he possibly know that? Only 2 people knew what happened, you and me. 3 people, Ian corrected, his voice heavy with regret. Dr. Marcus Harrison knew as well. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow to the chest. Dr. Marcus Harrison had been his friend, the only person in town he had trusted enough to bring into the secret when Ian's fever had spiked beyond anything Caleb could treat with frontier remedies. Harrison had sworn a sacred oath of secrecy, had promised on his honor as a physician that no one would ever know about the wounded Apache boy. Harrison's been dead for 3 years, Caleb said numbly. Yes, but before he died, Dr. Harrison confessed many things to his son, things that had weighed heavily on his conscience for years, Ian explained, including the night he helped save an Apache boy's life at Caleb Thornton's ranch. When young Dr. Harrison inherited his father's practice, he also inherited all of his father's substantial debts to Elias Whitman. Caleb felt physically sick, so he sold the information to clear what he owed. More than that, Ian said grimly. He provided Whitman with detailed intelligence about your property, your habits, your financial situation, your relationships in town, everything. Whitman needed to plan this theft with precision. Ian's jaw tightened with controlled anger. But young Dr. Harrison made one crucial error. He didn't know that his father had kept meticulous records of that night, medical notes, detailed sketches of my injuries, even a pressed flower from the traditional healing plants you gathered to help save my life. Caleb remembered those plants vividly, wild herbs that grew near the creek, traditional Apache remedies that Ian had whispered to him through fevered delirium. Caleb had spent hours searching for them in the pre-dawn darkness, following the boy's halting instructions because they represented his only hope of survival. Those records are going to be your salvation, Ian continued, because they prove beyond any possible doubt that I was near death when you found me. No healthy Apache warrior, no dangerous fugitive would have been in the condition those medical notes describe. The documented injuries show clearly that I was a victim who needed help. not a threat to be harbored. Why does that matter from a legal standpoint? Caleb asked. Because Whitman's entire strategy depends on portraying you as an Indian sympathizer who knowingly harbored a dangerous Apache fugitive, Ian explained with the precision of someone who had studied every angle. He intends to use the anti-Apache sentiment that still runs strong in many parts of this territory to justify seizing your property as punishment for what he'll characterize as treason against civilized society. Ian's voice carried cold fury. But Dr. Harrison's medical records prove incontrovertibly that you saved a dying child, not harbored a dangerous warrior. They document an act of pure Christian charity, not political sympathy for hostile Indians. Caleb stared at him with growing admiration and amazement. You've thought of absolutely everything. I've had 15 years to think about it, Ian replied simply. 15 years to plan for the day when I could properly repay what you did for me. 15 years to build the knowledge, the skills, the alliances necessary to ensure that when that day came, justice would be served completely. The young chief's expression grew resolute, and Caleb caught a glimpse of the natural leader he had become. Tomorrow, when Whitman arrives with Sheriff Morrison and his fraudulent court order, he won't find a helpless rancher with no proof of his innocence. He'll find a man with overwhelming evidence, credible witnesses, and the backing of unified tribes who have committed themselves to ensuring justice is served. Caleb looked out at the 200 mounted warriors waiting in perfect formation, then back at Ian's determined face. The transformation was still almost impossible to fully grasp. The dying boy had become something extraordinary. And if legal justice proves insufficient, Caleb asked quietly, then Elias Whitman will learn what happens when someone tries to destroy the life of a man who saved mine, Ian said with quiet finality. Some debts of honor can only be paid in full, Caleb. Tomorrow, one way or another, yours will be. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, casting the assembled warriors in sharp relief against the Texas landscape, Caleb realized that the scared, broken boy he had once nursed back to health had grown into something far more powerful and dangerous than he had ever imagined. And tomorrow, 15 years of careful planning, investigation, and preparation would finally come to fruition in ways that would change both their lives forever. The debt of honor that had begun with a dying Apache boy was about to be paid in full, and Elias Whitman was about to discover that some acts of kindness echo through time with consequences no schemer could have foreseen. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you incredible true stories from the American frontier that history books often overlook. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness and justice, and let us know in the comments which part of this story touched your heart the most. Until next time, remember that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change the world in ways we never expect. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you incredible true stories from the American frontier that history books often overlook. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness and justice, and let us know in the comments which part of this story touched your heart the most. Until next time, remember that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can change the world in ways we never expect.